It's about 15 years since I first came across this label natural sequence farming. A friend and colleague of mine rang me up and he said, I'm involved with an old farmer in the Hunter region and he's doing some very interesting things. And my friend said, I want to organise a group to go up there, about 12 people, have a look at what he's done, have a listen to him and give us your opinion on what you've seen. Do you want to come? And I said, sure. And he said, by the way, you'll be away a couple of days, so pack some pyjamas. I said, that's fine. He said, well, there's a car going up from your way somewhere. There'll be 3 others in it. Meet them at a certain spot and you're away. And I did that. I didn't know anyone in the car. We didn't know each other. I'm not sure the driver knew where he was really going. But we headed up through Burua, Cowra and so on. And it was a hot, dry autumn following a very hot, dry summer, a bit like the one our districts had in the last summer. And there wasn't a blade of green grass to be seen all the way up. And we got to Rollstone and we turned up this valley, kept going for a while. Then suddenly in the distance, there were a bunch of timbered sandstone hills. And running down in front of these hills was this enormous patch of green grass. And we were a bit staggered by this. We didn't quite know who it belonged to, but the driver turned into the gate and it turns out it was on the farm we were visiting. This old guy came out and he said, how are you? My name's Peter Andrews. And we said, g'day, had a bit of a look at his garden. He said, come and have a cup of tea. We had a cup of tea and then he showed us a video of what his farm looked like before he'd got to it and rehabilitated to it. And the video showed a rain event with huge amounts of water pouring off these hills, rushing down the middle of his floodplain through a excised creek and disappearing. He said after a day or two, there was no more water in his place and whatever fertility he'd accumulated had been washed away too. He said, come and have a look what I've done. So we went up to this huge area of green and it was quite staggering. He'd constructed a series of leaky weirs across this eroded creek. He'd planted hundreds and hundreds of willows. The degradation had formed little banks and he'd got his a mass of reeds back into this creek line. He had Phragmites about 3.5, 4 metres high, I reckon. The willows were totally blanked out by vegetation in the line of the creek. And he'd built up with these leaky weirs, he'd built up the excised portion up to the level of the floodplain, and he had a little bulldozer and he'd cut these lines, these drainage lines along the contour at various stages down the creek to spread the water across his floodplain. He didn't give much away up the paddock. He said a few things that I remember because they kind of set me back a bit. The first thing he said was, you know, in the ancient Australian landscape, the rivers ran on the high ground. And he just said that and I kind of let it, I don't know what the others thought, but I let it go on the top of my head for a while. But he said, it's only since settlement that the creeks have become excised and the water flowing in the drainage lines of creeks has gone down below the floodplain. So I took that in, and the other thing he said was, you know, weeds are very good. And this was kind of pretty interesting too. And he insisted on finding the odd weed, and we had to go and pick a bit of the grass growing around the bottom of the weed and chew it and tell him how sweet it was. So I thought, well, this guy's very, very interesting. And then he said, and by the way, we don't use any inorganic fertilisers. They're just plant stimulants and they muck up the microbial plant water cycle and you'll get a boost at the start, but in the end they'll catch up with you and you'll regret you've used them. So I took that on board too. And then he took us over to another property run by Jerry Harvey. And Peter had been working on Jerry Harvey's property on about 6 kilometres of creek, and he'd done the same thing that he'd done on his own property. He'd set up all these leaky weirs across the drainage line. he'd fill the central drainage line with vegetation, and there was this huge choke of vegetation slowing the water, virtually stopping the water, but not quite stopping the water. It was being retained in the drainage line, and once the banks had got up to once the weirs had got up high enough, he was able to redirect that across the floodplain. And I looked at this and I kind of shook my head with amazement. And I remember looking down into one of the shallow pools of water amongst the reed beds, and there were thousands and thousands of river she oak germinating in the bottom of the creek. But that was really only the start of things. That night, Jerry Harvey organised a show and tell at Jerry's place. We ended up spending the night there. And Peter took to the floor to explain us what his philosophy was, how had he arrived at this. So I think that's my first slide. So Peter said he'd spent 20 years trying to understand the ancient Australian landscape. He realised it had been a self-sustaining and efficient system because it was able to cope with periodic long periods of dryness and short episodic heavy rainfall events and keep the whole system going. He'd done a few experiments himself. He'd travelled widely across Australia, and he figured out that the key landscape mechanisms that were going on didn't differ from where he was in Australia. There was one system, and it had evolved to handle the long dries and the short wets. And in arriving at this story, he'd done a lot of reading of the accounts of early explorers. Sturt, Oxley, Leichhardt, you name it, he appeared to have read it. And he pointed out, I mean, these guys, I used to think of them as sort of military people and surveyors and so on, but a lot of them were very smart environmentalists. They were almost on to describing how the landscape was managed naturally in their diaries. And Peter also noted that these guys kept talking about these vast areas of green grass, these floodplains 50 to 100 kilometres wide, the enormous biodiversity of grasses, of tall forbs, of short forbs, of flowering plants and other forms of vegetation. And Peter said, well, it's fairly obvious from what we see today that post-settlement agriculture has degraded these ingredients. So natural sequence farming, in Peter's mind, is about putting these ingredients back. Now, Peter had realised and recognised that the two key drivers of this natural sequence were plants, that means biodiversity, and in-ground water. And they were the two ingredients that had largely been lost by modern agricultural practices. So he said, well, how can I put them back? That's what I'm on about. If I can put back these two ingredients, these two drivers of landscape function, then I might expect the landscape once again to manage itself efficiently over these dry periods and wet periods and give us this continuum of green grass that the early explorers were always noting, and to give us the spongy soils they were noting, to give us the swampy areas, the heavy ruts, wheel tracks and so on, the difficulties they had getting across these so-called chains of ponds, these wet areas everywhere. Okay, so how do we restore in-ground water? Well, what Peter decided to do is to put back what he thought was there, and they were a step set of ponds with wetlands at the top and bottom of each step. So these ponds in the landscape were held together by leaky weirs. So these leaky weirs are essentially sponge plugs of reed beds and sediments and so on. And to put back, at least until once you get up to the contour, put back these contour lines or these banks, which were apparently in the original landscape, to carry the water further in the floodplain. So Peter said the key drivers of the system, we've heard it all today, are plants. Plants are the solar pumps that drive the whole system. all plants are plants. Grasses, forbs, weeds, trees. As long as it's a living plant and photosynthesising, you want it, and you want it there being green 100% of the time. Okay, the weed story was elaborated on. Why are weeds so critical to fertility renewal? Peter spoke of our high fertility grasses. They are highly palatable. When they're eaten by livestock, because they are highly palatable and high fertility, they cause a decrease in fertility in the landscape. If we don't do anything about it, the quality of the grasses will continue to decline, and the grazing potential will be reduced. But then the weeds come along. Nature says there's a bunch of plants out there. These are your tall or your short forbs. Some people call them weeds. These are the things with the big tap roots. They come up and they bring up the minerals and the sugars and whatever. They grow enormously in the paddock. They fall over and they're consumed by microbes on the surface in a mulching process. And these things, in so doing, enhance the fertility of the soil. So nature doesn't spray weeds, nor should we. Which weeds? All weeds. Now that comment's got him into a lot of trouble, I've noticed, since I first met him. Yeah, but that's the way it is. Okay, so I had a look at what Peter had done. I didn't know what to think. I came home. I actually dug up a Phragmites plant from Jerry Harvey's creek, brought it home, stuck it in the ground. Of course, it died. So I didn't do much for 3 or 4 years, except I did read the explorers' accounts, and I found them fascinating. Especially Ludwig Leichhardt, because he was always talking about chains of ponds. He was always having trouble getting over these chains of ponds in Western Queensland. And then there was Sturt. Sturt came across as a really clever environmentalist. Major Mitchell. And then I read a few more recent ones about early settlers describing their life in our region. And I thought, how fantastic. And then I read about McDowell Stewart, who was an explorer in the most arid regions of Australia. He goes up to the Strzelecki Track and he finds a huge wetland and he calls it Hergot Springs. And he sells the map to Mr. Hergot, who was a German immigrant who was financing him. So Mr. Hergot takes up, I don't know how many, 100 or 1,000 cattle, and within 3 years that wetland disappeared from the face of Australia. You go to Hergot Springs today, it's Maree. And I just sort of shook my head and I thought I've got to do something. And it finally dawned upon me that we had a very eroded old excise creek running through one of our paddocks, and it probably once was a chain of ponds. So I thought, well, we'll have a go at trying to restore it in terms of what I'd seen at Peter's place. So I've got the steps, what we did. Firstly, we fenced it out. And then we built leaky weirs across it at various choke points. Now, if Peter had seen it, he would have said, oh, well, you've probably put them in the wrong place, but that's beside the point. We put some in. And every time we went out there, we took a load of rocks out there and built them up. We had to reintroduce some vegetation because it was bare with erosion holes and so on. So I took his advice and I planted heaps of willows, and they grew. I had a bit of a go with she oaks and they wouldn't grow. So I got a whole heap of willows growing, and then I noticed that kumbungi came naturally. There always was a bit of kumbungi here and there around the property, so the birds brought that in, but I couldn't find any reeds. And I spent quite a bit of time cruising around looking for a good reed bed, and I found one, Doughboy Creek. Martin Royds would know where Doughboy Creek is. It's between Bungadore and Braidwood. And it's a fantastic Phragmites reed bed. It's totally choked. And every time I crossed Doughboy's Creek, I'd get out with a pick and I'd dig up half a dozen. I don't know if that's legal, Martin, or not, but I did it. And then we started planting trees on the ridge, the recharge areas on our place, again to try and slow down the movement of moisture. And we certainly these days treat weeds as fertility enhancers. We love them. Okay, so I'm not suggesting you follow me, but because there is now over the last 15 years, there's been a lot of work down at Balloon Creek. Peter Andrews has been down there. They've set up magnificent chains of ponds, got all the reed beds back and so on, and they now run a course on natural sequence farming. It's run by Stuart, Peter's son, and I understand it's a very good course. So those of you that want to get into this, that's probably the professional way to do it, not copy me. Okay, so where do we get to on this? Well, I put up a bit of a balance sheet. We started off with a deeply eroded, mostly dry creek bed. You know, it had water in at times. After a big rain, it would rust through and just cause a bit more erosion. We've now got permanent water in that creek bed. It's held in the landscape. It's held under the reeds, so we've got negligible evaporation. And we've got a continuous flow. Now, every time I go out there, I've got to check to see if it's still flowing, and it's always flowing. It just drips slowly down as it moves down the valley from pond to pond. So we've got permanent water. The creek line was salinity prone. You can see this on the neighbour's place. Salinity moves laterally through the soil, and where you get excised areas, it comes out at the excision with the lateral movement. We don't have any salinity because if you put the plants back, which means you've got to have the water back, the in-ground water back, you've got a freshwater lens sitting there above the salt. So your salt problems disappear. We've gone from poor to negligible vegetation to a permanent green swath. And it's great in a dry year like this. We've actually got green grass, continuous green grass. We've got enormous biological activity. You can see that going on around both within the creek and outside the creek. So we've improved the vegetation dramatically. We've also got now permanent aquatic and bird life. We've got freshwater mussels, snails, frogs, you name it. We've got I don't know half of what these things are. And I didn't know what a reed warbler was until I said to Charlie, come have a look at my little chain of ponds. He came out, and Charlie, being a great bird, he spotted this little reed warbler. And all of that makes it a very rewarding project. I've got a few pictures here. So that's where we're at now. You'll see up on the sort of, see there's still an erosion area outside the chain of ponds I haven't fixed. But you can see our willows got going down the line, and our Phragmites and our Kimbungi. The aim for me is to get complete coverage of all the water. So I don't see any water. So all the water is in ground, just below the surface. So I'm not there yet in some of the ponds. There's a pond I'm still working on. I've got to, I was going to say I've got to nick a few more plants from the creek down there, but I'll take my own now and spread them around a bit more. So there's a nice bit of reed bed. Now, I've read amongst the early explorers that the reed beds they found were 5 metres high, and I find that extraordinary. Now, Peter Andrews is probably 3.5. Mine are about, be lucky to make 2 metres, so I kind of think I've got a long way to go, but we're working on it. And there's a nice bank of Phragmites, and there's Charlie's little friend again, the reed warbler. How productive is this? Peter Hazel, who's the guru now on natural sequence farming, he likes to talk about 20 to 60%. Now I think it's much more than that. And I don't measure anything because I spent my life measuring things for people. So I don't measure anything. I like looking at things and so on. But it occurs to me what we've done. Those of you that watch Gardening Australia, how do you grow your veggies now? Who uses wicking beds? Anyone use wicking beds? Yeah. Okay. So every time my wife Jane, she's mad on wicking beds, so we've had to stick all our veggies in wicking beds. And wicking beds, really the model is, you've got 100% moisture sitting permanently, but moisture is always there below the root zone, and it's wicked up by the plants. And the productivity we get out of a wicking bed is extraordinary. It is many, many times what we get out of planting veggies in the ground and watering them. So my guess is the productivity gains from this can be enormous if we're prepared to do it. And it's also a lot of fun. Thanks, Rosanna.